So with Unit 3, which is the American Revolution and Founding Documents, we're going to read several of the chapters from the We the People online text. For Lesson 4, I'd like to walk you through how I would take notes from this particular lesson. So we'll be going back and forth between the online textbook and your notes, or what actually are my notes. And so I'd like for you to get down kind of what I have. Of course, you can tailor them for yourself for your own benefit, but this way you can kind of see what I'm trying to get you to examine from Lesson 4. And of course, there'll be a quiz after we have gone through Lesson 4, and you'll take that quiz without your notes, and we'll see how well you do with that. So to get started, if you'll go to the online textbook with Unit 1, Lesson 4, which is here, our unit is Unit 3, but in the textbook it's Unit 1, Lesson 4. And also you'll need a piece of notebook paper. Now, these notes still have to be handwritten. You cannot type them. I want you to write them by hand for a very particular reason, because I think that if you actually write it by hand, you're more likely to remember what the content is of the lesson than if you were to type it out. So now that you have your online textbook ready to go and a piece of notebook paper, let's go ahead and get started. So the first question, of course, that you're going to need to write down on your notes is, what were the British origins of American constitutionalism? So here's the beginning of my notes, and this is the first page, and I actually came up with about 5 pages of notes. So I've got Unit 3 at the top, so I've highlighted Unit 3 right here for you, right here, somehow putting the unit at the top of your notes. I've got the date when I did that on 11/7/2016. I put my name just in case I lose them. And then I put some notes here for us. You don't have to put these down, but I want you to, as we're going through Lesson 4, to read, take notes, and then review. So we'll read a little bit, and then you'll take some notes from a particular, say, paragraph, and then I want you to go back after we're all done every once in a while and review what you've written. I want you to focus on both the detail of each section and, once you review, to step back and see the big picture. And then we need to start making connections with the things we've learned with prior knowledge and what we're learning now. And you'll see what I'm talking about in just a second, I hope. So the title of my notes are Lesson 4, What were the British origins of American constitutionalism? And so what I do when I take notes, I have a couple of different colors of pens and maybe some highlighters. Something that will help me differentiate between different things that I'm trying to do within my notes. So I'm using black pen to take the notes, and then the lighter gray area is pencil. But I'm focusing on British origins of American constitutionalism. So what I did here is I put the question, I kind of rephrased it in my own words, and I put, where did we come from? I mean, that's the whole point of looking at why Lesson 4. Why Lesson 4 in the context of Unit 3, the American Revolution and Founding Documents? I want you to start thinking about why you're learning what you're learning. And so we're looking at where we're coming from in terms of America. And of course, where we're coming from is from Great Britain. Anytime that you're reading a word, or there's a word particularly in a heading or subheading that you don't know, you need to take time to stop and look it up. I like dictionary.com. It's a quick way to type it in, and you can look it up very quickly. So Constitution, what's that? So if I were writing this and I'm pretending like I'm a student, I might think, exactly what is a Constitution? Well, I wrote that down and then I answered it, of course. If you can't find an answer that you like, well, then you have the question, but you come to class with that question and you ask me that question. I've written down here that a Constitution is a set of laws that creates or runs government. So that's what I have here. Now what I have here for the answer, all of this information here, I don't know if you can see the cursor on my screen moving around, but if you can, all of that's written down after I finish reading Lesson 4. So you're going to you're going to leave a couple of spaces blank for after you read. You're going to come back and answer that question. So then I've got the first question here, how did English government begin? I would encourage you strongly to write in terms of abbreviations and use your own method for making it easier for you to write and to read your own notes. Also, as you get started, this is kind of a lengthy reading. So it took me about an hour to really go through in detail and read all of it very particularly and go back and review it. I would imagine it would take a student maybe an hour and a half. So really I would encourage you to spend 2 or 3 segments of time reading this instead of sitting down and trying to read it all at one time. I did it in halves. I did one half, and I'll show you where I stopped in just a second. I did one half, and then I came back and I read the other half. Because it's really difficult to maintain that focus and understanding if you're reading more than, say, 30 or even 45 minutes. So I would recommend maybe 3 segments of 30 minutes of time. That means if you get started in it in class, say for example, you spend, 10 or 15 minutes on it, then you should finish it for homework. Really, every class day that we have, I would recommend spending about 30 minutes of time in addition to that class and doing homework to practice with what we're learning or to prepare for what we're going to learn in the next class. So I would say 3 nights of homework you're going to be spending doing just this reading. And then you'll also have a little time in class like we're doing, hopefully on the first day that we're going over this. So once you have that first question written down, then you're going to move on to the second page of We the People. And of course, you might need to be going back and forth between what we're doing and the screencast, because I don't want to take up the time doing the screencast playing all of the videos. But here for the lesson purpose, I would definitely read through that so you'll understand what you're trying to read. This would also be helpful to go back to after we're all finished and make sure you understand the lesson's purpose. So you can read through this here, take a moment to do that. You might even want to pause our screencast so you can read it on the screen, and then maybe even play the video, which won't take long. And then the next page are the lesson objectives. Again, this would be really good to come back to and quiz yourself on these objectives here to make absolutely sure you understand those objectives. The key terms are here in blue, and of course, either way you want to do this is fine. I always embed my terms within my notes, but you may want to have a separate section maybe in the margins or at the beginning or the end of your notes so that you actually list the terms and you have them defined somehow. But again, I embed them in my own notes. So the first question, as you saw in my notes, was how did English government begin? And so what I did is I would read a paragraph and then I would pause and then I would take notes on it. So if you'll take just a second, maybe even to pause the screencast, and read through this paragraph, even maybe this bottom part here, so that you can take a moment to try to think about what you would write down for notes from this section. So if you've done that, if you've read this section here, this page, notice the Roman Empire right here. I mean, the Roman Empire is pretty significant in terms of cause and effect. So after the Roman Empire, then a couple of things happen. So it goes down to the bottom. The English monarch had to let the people in local areas tend to their own affairs according to customs they had developed over the years. And then you've got William the Conqueror here, and that's pretty significant. So when I go back over to my notes, so again, as I go back over to my notes, you'll see, number 1, how did English government begin? Well, I've highlighted the fall of Rome and also William the Conqueror. Now, in the next couple of pages, you're going to see that he's mentioned actually quite a good bit. There's a couple of times that he's mentioned. If something like that is repetitively mentioned, that's an indication that you probably want to write that down. So there's the fall of Rome and William the Conqueror, and then I've also mentioned the Battle of Hastings. So once we've got that, then we go back to the text, and we're going to go to the next page. And again, you may want to pause the screencast for just a second so that you can read through what's on this page, and again, try to think about what you would write about if you were going to take notes. So hopefully you would identify, if you were going to take notes, key terms like feudalism, and of course this is still talking about William the Conqueror and kings, but also one of the main concepts if you're going to move on to take advanced level courses like honors courses in the future or AP level courses. Some of the things you want to keep in mind to learn how to recognize is change over time. In other words, cause and effect. So you've got the fall of Rome, then William the Conqueror, and then this paragraph here that really is beginning to talk about the effects of the fall of Rome and William the Conqueror and how this leads into something called Parliament. Hopefully you recognize the word Parliament, and hopefully you know how significant Parliament is to England. But if you don't, the next pages will explain that to you. And you might have to go back in your chapter and reread some sections, and that's okay. I'm not expecting you to read this once all the way through and that's it and be done with it. You won't be able to identify the key content doing just that. So again, on my notes, I'll scroll up just a little bit so we could see all of the first point where I've talked about the fall of Rome, William the Conqueror and how he's mentioned a lot, and that he established feudalism. Now, I might not know what feudalism is, or hopefully I do, maybe remember that from a previous world history class. But if I don't, I might want to write down what that is. That's a relationship where the kings, the nobles, the vassals, and the serfs are all in kind of an agreement together, where the king will give land to nobles in exchange for military. The nobles and the vassals have an agreement where the vassals will say work for the nobles for protection. And the same thing, serfs will work for vassals for protection. So I've identified that key word, but I also need to understand why that's important. Why are we talking about feudalism with the British government? Because William the Conqueror, who had established this and helped establish this, also had to adopt English customs and practices to keep the peace. That's where Parliament is going to be formed, because it develops due to the fact that kings are using advisors to rule the land and they're going to need money. And notice I've put a date here by the 13th century. Now, dates aren't entirely significant, most of them, for civics, but we need to kind of place them in context for history. I also put in pink here some cause and effect things, like the fall of Rome as a cause, and then William the Conqueror and the development of Parliament are some effects. And so you have to start thinking about that causation, cause and effect. Again, that's really important if you're going to take upper level courses or AP courses in the future. That's a big deal. Because looking at causation or cause and effect will help you to analyze why things happen the way that they do. So now we're going to take a look at the second question. How did parliamentary government begin, or in England begin? And you can already see some of the key terms here in blue. But you may want to pause the screencast for just a moment so you can read through this page. Try to figure out, if you were taking notes, what you would write down. So the first paragraph has some things that might be important, like where this comes from, the councils formed Parliament. But of course, this second section here with model Parliament is going to be the more significant of the two sections that you're going to be taking notes on. So we'll go back to my notes in just a second. But hopefully you can identify that the model Parliament is pretty significant, that it has two representative parts or houses, and that's going to be similar to Congress. If you knew that already, you would definitely know that's pretty important to write down. And the House of Lords and House of Commons are their title, but then also who uses them and how. They use the House of Lords and the House of Commons, being the king and the citizens, and again, how they use them. And again, you can write down exactly what I have on my notes or try to kind of modify that to make it your own. But I've got where King Edward I is creating the model Parliament, two representative parts. In 1295, it's the House of Lords and what the House of Lords is, and the House of Commons and what the House of Commons is. So the House of Lords is made up of feudal nobility and major church officials, where the House of Commons has 2 knights from a shire, 2 citizens from each city, and then my little ditto marks here, it means the same as above, so 2 citizens from each borough. And again, it's not from the common people necessarily, but more from the wealthy people, just not the nobility. And then of course I've got the viewpoints, which is another key thing to identify if you're going into advanced level courses or AP courses, how the kings use Parliament for money and power influence, and how the citizens use Parliament to voice their concerns and to limit the king's power. So again, I've gone back and then I've tried to take a second to review what I've written before in terms of using the highlights to identify which parts are the most important for my notes before I move on to another section. So this is the end of the first section for the screencast. So in section 2, we're going to cover a couple of more pieces.